The gunshot echoed across the valley like a death knell, followed by the thunderous pounding of hooves that made grown men step back from their fence posts. Thunder's shadow was running again, the midnight black stallion whose very name had become synonymous with the untamable spirit of the American West. For 3 years, he had roamed the rugged terrain of Cedar Valley, leaving behind him a trail of broken corrals, injured cowboys, and shattered dreams. Kestrel Hawthorne heard the commotion from his modest farmhouse perched on the valley's eastern slope. Unlike his neighbors, he didn't rush to his window to catch a glimpse of the legendary horse. Instead, he continued kneading the dough for tomorrow's bread, his weathered hands working with the same patient rhythm they had maintained for the past 15 years, since he'd inherited the struggling farm from his grandfather. At 42, Kestrel was known throughout Cedar Valley as the quiet farmer who kept to himself. His neighbors respected him but found him peculiar, a man who spoke more to his handful of rescued animals than to people, who could coax vegetables from the most stubborn soil, and who had never once raised his voice, even when drought threatened, to claim his livelihood. The pounding hooves drew closer, and through his kitchen window, Kestrel finally saw him, Thunder's shadow in all his magnificent fury. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian in the afternoon sun, his mane flowing like liquid night, as he galloped across the open meadow that bordered Kestrel's property. Behind him, 3 riders on horseback struggled to keep pace, their lassos spinning uselessly in the air. Jackson Rourke, the valley's most renowned horsebreaker, led the pursuit. His face was flushed with determination and frustration as he spurred his mount forward. "Corner him at the creek," he shouted to his companions. "We've got him this time." But Thunder's shadow had other plans. With a grace that defied his massive frame, the stallion leaped the creek in a single bound and disappeared into the thick woodland that marked the boundary of Kestrel's land. The pursuing riders pulled up short at the water's edge, their horses snorting and pawing the ground nervously. That evening, as Kestrel made his rounds feeding his small menagerie, 2 aging mares, a blind mule named Sage, and a 3-legged dog called Poet, he found fresh hoofprints near his barn. They were larger than any domestic horses, pressed deep into the soft earth with the weight of wild freedom. The next morning brought Jackson Rourke to Kestrel's door, his hat in his hands but his eyes burning with ambition. "That devil horse spent the night somewhere on your land," he announced without preamble. "I'm offering you $500 to let me set traps in your woods." Kestrel studied the man's face, noting the rope burns on his palms and the fresh scratches on his arms. "Why do you want him so badly?" "Why?" Jackson's laugh was bitter. "That horse has made a fool of every man in 3 counties. Senator Caldwell's offering $10,000 to whoever brings Thunder's shadow to his ranch. 10,000, Hawthorne. That's enough to buy a spread twice the size of yours." Kestrel's gaze drifted to his fields, where the morning mist was lifting to reveal rows of carefully tended crops. "And what happens to the horse after you catch him?" "What happens to any wild thing once it learns its place?" Jackson replied with a shrug. "He'll be broken, trained, and put to work like any other horse. That's the natural order." The farmer was quiet for a long moment, his calloused fingers tracing the worn wood of his door frame. In the distance, a hawk circled lazily in the warming air, riding the thermals with effortless grace. "No," Kestrel said finally. "My land is not for trapping." Jackson Rourke's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "You're making a mistake, Hawthorne. That beast is dangerous. He nearly killed Bronson Hayes last month when he tried to rope him near Miller's Point." Kestrel nodded slowly. "I heard about that. I also heard Bronson had been drinking and decided to show off for his new bride by going after Thunder's shadow alone." "That's beside the point," Jackson snapped. "A wild horse that attacks people needs to be dealt with. If you won't help us catch him properly, we'll have to shoot him." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Kestrel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only sign of the emotion stirring beneath his calm exterior. "That would be a tragedy," he said quietly. After Jackson left, muttering curses under his breath, Kestrel walked to his vegetable garden where he always did his best thinking. The tomatoes were coming in well this year, fat and red on their sturdy vines. He picked a few for lunch, his mind turning over the morning's conversation. That evening, as twilight painted the valley in shades of purple and gold, Kestrel sat on his front porch with a cup of coffee and his grandfather's old journal. The leather-bound book contained decades of observations about the land, the weather, and the animals that called Cedar Valley home. His grandfather, Orion Hawthorne, had been something of a horse whisperer in his day, known for his ability to gentle even the most spirited animals. A horse's heart is like a locked door. One entry read in his grandfather's careful script. Force will only make the lock rust tighter. But patience is the key that opens any door. A sound made Kestrel look up from the journal. There, at the edge of his property where the meadow met the forest, stood Thunder's shadow. The stallion was motionless except for the wind stirring his magnificent mane, his dark eyes fixed on the man sitting quietly on the porch. For several minutes, neither moved. Kestrel felt his breath catch in his throat. Up close, Thunder's shadow was even more magnificent than the stories suggested. He stood nearly 17 hands high, his muscled frame speaking of power and endurance earned through years of freedom in the wilderness. Scars marked his hide, testament to battles fought and won against predators, rivals, and men who sought to claim him. But it was the horse's eyes that captured Kestrel's attention. They held intelligence, certainly, but also something deeper, a wariness born of betrayal, a pain that ran soul deep. Slowly, Kestrel closed the journal and set his coffee cup aside. He stood without sudden movements, his hands visible and empty. Thunder's shadow tensed, ready to bolt, but something in the man's demeanor made him pause. "Easy, friend," Kestrel murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not here to hurt you." The stallion snorted, ears flicking forward and back as he studied this strange human who made no move to approach, who carried no rope or weapon. For a moment, Kestrel thought Thunder's shadow might step closer. Instead, the horse turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest as silently as he had appeared. But he returned the next evening, and the next, always at twilight, always keeping his distance, but each night venturing a little closer to the porch where Kestrel sat, reading his grandfather's journal. On the fourth evening, Kestrel left a bucket of oats at the edge of his property line before settling into his chair. He pretended to read while watching from the corner of his eye as Thunder's shadow approached the offering. The stallion circled the bucket warily, nostrils flaring as he tested the air for any trace of trap or deception. Finding none, he lowered his great head and ate. From that night forward, their routine was established. Kestrel would leave food and water, then sit on his porch in comfortable silence while Thunder's shadow ate. Neither made any move toward the other, but a fragile trust began to form in the space between them, built on consistency, respect, and the farmer's infinite patience. 2 weeks into their evening meetings, disaster struck. Kestrel woke to the sound of Thunder's shadow screaming, a sound that cut through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. He bolted from his bed, pulling on boots and grabbing his lantern, as the anguished cries continued from somewhere in the woods beyond his property line. Racing through the forest, Kestrel followed the sound until he came upon a sight that made his blood run cold. Thunder's shadow was caught in a wire snare, the cruel metal cutting into his front leg as he thrashed against his bonds. The more he struggled, the tighter the wire became, and already blood matted his midnight coat. "Steady, steady now," Kestrel breathed, setting down his lantern and approaching slowly despite every instinct screaming at him to hurry. Thunder's shadow's eyes rolled white with panic and pain, but something in the farmer's voice penetrated his terror. The stallion's struggles slowed, though his entire body trembled with the effort of restraint. Working by lamplight, Kestrel examined the snare. It was professionally made, the kind Jackson Rourke would use. The wire had bitten deep, but if he could free the horse quickly, the damage wouldn't be permanent. The challenge was getting close enough to work without spooking Thunder's shadow into another panic that would worsen his injuries. "I know you're scared," Kestrel murmured, pulling wire cutters from his toolkit. "I know you don't trust men, and you have good reason not to. but I need you to trust me now just for a few minutes. Can you do that?" Thunder's shadow's breathing was labored, his magnificent head hanging low with exhaustion and pain. When Kestrel took another step closer, the horse flinched but didn't bolt. Another step, then another, until the farmer was close enough to touch the wire. The metal was slick with blood, making it difficult to grip. Kestrel worked carefully, talking in low, soothing tones as he positioned the cutters. "Almost there. Friend. Just a little longer." The wire snapped with a metallic ping, and Thunder's shadow lurched backward, free but wounded. He stood on 3 legs, favoring the injured limb as he stared at the man who had freed him. For a moment their eyes met in the lamplight, predator and prey roles forgotten in the face of a simple act of compassion. Then Thunder's shadow limped away into the darkness, leaving Kestrel alone with the cruel reminder of human greed coiled. In the forest floor, the next morning brought Jackson Rourke pounding on Kestrel's door, his face thunderous with rage. "Someone cut my snare," he accused without preamble. "That horse was caught clean, and some bleeding heart turned him loose." Kestrel met his gaze steadily. "That trap was on my land, Jackson. I told you before, no trapping here." "Your land ends at the creek," Jackson snarled. "I checked the property markers myself." "The creek moved course after the spring floods," Kestrel replied calmly. "That snare was set on my side of the new boundary. I have every right to remove it." The 2 men stared at each other, the tension crackling between them like electricity before a storm. Finally, Jackson stepped back, his hand moving unconsciously to the gun at his hip. "You think you're doing that animal a favor," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "But all you've done is delay the inevitable. Senator Caldwell wants that horse, and what the senator wants, he gets. If we can't take Thunder's shadow alive, we'll take him dead. At least then he won't suffer." After Jackson left, Kestrel walked to the spot where he'd freed Thunder's shadow. Blood still stained the forest floor, and deep gouges in the earth showed how desperately the stallion had fought against his bonds. The sight filled Kestrel with a cold fury he rarely allowed himself to feel. That evening, Thunder's shadow didn't come to the meadow, nor the next evening or the next. Kestrel left food and water anyway, hoping against hope that the injured horse was still alive somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded Cedar Valley. On the 4th night, a sound made him look up from his grandfather's journal. Thunder's shadow stood at the forest's edge, but something was different. The proud arch of his neck was subdued, and he moved with the careful gait of an animal still healing. But he had returned. More than that, he had brought company. 3 other horses emerged from the shadows behind their leader, a paint mare with intelligent eyes, a young chestnut stallion full of nervous energy, and an elderly bay gelding whose gray muzzle spoke of many years spent running free. Thunder's shadow had brought his family, his herd, to the one place in Cedar Valley where they might find sanctuary. Kestrel rose slowly from his chair, his heart hammering with the significance of the moment. Thunder's shadow was offering him something precious beyond measure: trust, not just from himself, but from those he was sworn to protect. "You're all welcome here," Kestrel said softly. "Stay as long as you need to." Over the following weeks, an extraordinary transformation began to unfold on Kestrel's modest farm. The wild herd established their own rhythm alongside the farmer's daily routine, grazing in his meadows during the day and disappearing into the forest at night. Thunder's shadow's wounded leg healed cleanly, leaving only a thin white scar as a reminder of man's cruelty. But more significant than the physical healing was the trust that grew between horse and man. It started small, Thunder's shadow, allowing Kestrel to approach within 20 feet without bolting, then 15, then the breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday when Kestrel slipped in the mud while carrying feed to his barn. Thunder's shadow, who had been grazing nearby, actually took a step toward the fallen farmer before catching himself and backing away. "It's all right," Kestrel said, pushing himself to his feet and wiping mud from his hands. "Thank you for caring." The stallion's ears pricked forward at the words, and for the first time since they'd met, Thunder's shadow didn't retreat when Kestrel resumed his work. News of the wild herd taking refuge on Hawthorne land spread through Cedar Valley like wildfire. Some neighbors came by out of curiosity, others with warnings about the danger of harboring such creatures. Old Minerva Blackthorn, the valley's unofficial historian, brought a different perspective. "Your grandfather would be proud," she told Kestrel as they watched Thunder's shadow teach the young chestnut proper herd behavior. "Orion always said this land was meant to be a sanctuary. The Shoshone who lived here before us called this valley, place where spirits rest. Maybe they knew something we forgot. Not everyone approved of Kestrel's unconventional approach. Senator Caldwell himself paid a visit, arriving in a gleaming black automobile with 2 armed men at his side. The senator was a man accustomed to getting his way. His money and political connections had paved every road he'd ever traveled. "I'm prepared to offer you $15,000 for that black stallion," Caldwell announced, not bothering with pleasantries. "That's more money than you'll see in 5 years of farming." Kestrel continued brushing down Sage, his elderly mule, as if the senator hadn't spoken. Thunder's shadow grazed in the near pasture, close enough to hear every word but showing no sign of concern. "He's not for sale," Kestrel said simply. Caldwell's face reddened. "Everything is for sale, Hawthorne. It's just a matter of finding the right price. 20,000. That's my final offer." "No amount of money will change my answer," Kestrel replied, setting down the brush and turning to face his visitor. "Thunder's shadow isn't property to be bought and sold. He's a living being who has chosen to trust me with his safety." "Trust?" Caldwell laughed harshly. "It's a horse, not a person. Animals don't have feelings or make choices. They respond to training, pain and reward, dominance and submission. That's the natural order." As if summoned by their conversation, Thunder's shadow lifted his head from the grass and looked directly at the senator. There was something unsettling about the stallion's steady gaze, an intelligence that made Caldwell unconsciously step back. "Natural order," Kestrel repeated quietly. "Tell me, Senator, what's natural about wire snares and loaded rifles? What's natural about breaking a creature's spirit for sport and profit?" The confrontation might have escalated, but at that moment, something extraordinary happened. The young chestnut from Thunder's shadow's herd had wandered close to the fence where they stood, drawn by curiosity about the strangers. Without warning, one of Caldwell's men reached out to grab the horses. "Halter!" The chestnut reared in alarm, striking out with his front hooves. One of the senator's bodyguards drew his weapon, but before he could fire, Thunder's shadow was there. Placing himself between the gun and the young horse, his black bulk shielding his herd member from harm. In that moment, everyone present witnessed something that challenged their understanding of animal behavior. Thunder's shadow hadn't acted on instinct or training. He had made a conscious choice to risk his own life for another. Caldwell holstered his gun with shaking hands. "This isn't over, Hawthorne," he muttered, retreating to his automobile. "That horse is too dangerous to run free. If you won't sell him, I'll find another way to claim him." After the senator left, Kestrel approached Thunder's shadow slowly, his heart full of gratitude and wonder. The stallion stood perfectly still as the farmer's hand touched his neck for the first time, a moment of connection that bridged the ancient divide between wild and tame, predator and prey. "You didn't have to do that," Kestrel whispered. "You could have run." Thunder's shadow turned his great head to look at the man beside him, and in his dark eyes Kestrel saw something that made his breath catch. Not submission, but partnership. The stallion had chosen to stand not because he was broken, but because he had found something worth protecting. Summer blazed hot and dry across Cedar Valley, turning the usually green pastures to tinder. The creek that marked Kestrel's property line dwindled to a muddy trickle, and even the deepest wells began to show signs of strain. It was the kind of season that tested every living thing's will to survive. Thunder's shadow and his herd had adapted to life at the farm with remarkable grace. The paint mare, whom Kestrel had quietly named Luna for the white crescent on her forehead, had revealed herself to be Thunder's shadow's mate and the herd's wise counselor. The elderly bay gelding, Sage's namesake, served as the group's guardian, always alert for danger. And the young chestnut, whom Kestrel called Phoenix for his fiery spirit, had grown bold enough to eat grain from the farmer's open palm. But their peaceful existence was about to face its greatest test. The fire started. In the hills east of town, a lightning strike on bone-dry timber that exploded into an inferno within hours. By afternoon, smoke clouded the sun, and the acrid smell of burning forest filled the air. Emergency bells rang from the church steeple as the volunteer fire brigade assembled, but everyone knew they were fighting a losing battle against nature's fury. Kestrel stood in his yard, watching the orange glow grow brighter on the horizon. The wind was shifting, pushing the fire toward Cedar Valley. If it jumped the ridge, everything in its path would burn, including his farm and the animals that depended on him for protection. Thunder's shadow appeared at his side, the stallion's nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Wild horses had an instinctive fear of fire, honed by countless generations of ancestors who had fled similar blazes across the open plains. Every muscle in Thunder's shadow's body was tense with the urge to run. "I know," Kestrel said softly, placing his hand on the horse's neck. "You should go. Take your herd and head for the river. You'll be safe there." But Thunder's shadow didn't move. He stood beside the farmer, watching the approaching disaster with eyes that reflected the distant flames. By nightfall, the fire had crowned the ridge and begun its descent toward the valley. Kestrel loaded his truck with the animals he could transport: Poet the three-legged dog, his two elderly mares, and several chickens that squawked in protest at their cages. But Sage the mule was too arthritic to make the journey to safety, and someone had to stay with him. "Go," Kestrel urged Thunder's shadow one final time. "This isn't your fight." The stallion's response was to move closer to the barn where Sage sheltered, positioning himself between the approaching fire and the vulnerable animals. Luna, Phoenix, and the old bay gelding followed his example, forming a protective circle. Around the farm buildings, through the long night they waited. The fire advanced like a living thing, consuming everything in its path with hungry roars and explosive cracks. Burning embers fell like deadly snow, starting spot fires that Kestrel battled with his garden hose and buckets of precious water. 3 a.m, when the flames were close enough to singe the trees at his property line, Thunder's shadow did something that would be talked about in Cedar Valley for generations to come. The stallion began to move, not away from the fire but toward it, his herd following in single file. "No!" Kestrel shouted, but his voice was lost in the roar of the flames. What happened next defied explanation. The horses began to run. Not in panic, but with purpose, their hooves pounding out a rhythm that seemed to shake the very earth. They ran parallel to the fire line, their bodies creating a wall of movement that somehow disrupted the wind patterns feeding the flames. It was Luna who made the difference. The paint mare broke from the group and galloped directly toward a gap in the fire line, where burning branches had fallen across the creek. With a leap that would have made Pegasus proud, she sailed over the flames and landed in the shallow water. Beyond, then began pawing and splashing, sending spray high into the air. Phoenix and the old bay followed her example, their combined efforts creating enough moisture and disturbance to slow the fire's advance at that crucial point. Thunder's shadow continued his parallel run, his powerful body cutting through the superheated air like a living windbreak. By dawn, the wind had shifted again, pushing the fire back toward the already burned ridgeline where it finally exhausted its fuel and died. Cedar Valley was saved, and at the center of the miracle stood a black stallion whose courage had turned the tide against impossible odds. The volunteer fire chief, a grizzled man named Dutch Carmichael, stood among the smoldering remains of what should have been a devastating blaze, shaking his head in amazement. "In 30 years of fighting fires, I've never seen anything like it," he told the gathered crowd of neighbors and reporters who had come to witness the aftermath. "Those horses didn't just save Hawthorne's farm, they saved the whole valley." Thunder's shadow stood in his pasture, his coat singed and his lungs raw from smoke, but his head held high with quiet dignity. He had proven something that night that no amount of money could buy, and no amount of force could compel. True loyalty was a gift freely given, not a commodity to be captured and sold. In the weeks following the fire, Cedar Valley buzzed with stories of Thunder's Shadow's heroic actions. Newspaper reporters came from as far away as Denver and San Francisco to interview Kestrel and photograph the stallion who had helped save an entire community. Thunder's Shadow tolerated the attention with characteristic dignity, but Kestrel could see the strain in his dark eyes. Senator Caldwell, however, was far from impressed by the horse's heroism. If anything, the public attention had only intensified his desire to possess Thunder's Shadow. He couldn't bear the thought that a simple farmer had succeeded where he and his money had failed. The senator's next move was as predictable as it was ruthless. He arrived at Kestrel's farm with a court order signed by Judge Pemberton, his longtime political ally and frequent hunting companion. This document declares Thunder's Shadow a public menace, Caldwell announced with barely concealed satisfaction. Any wild horse that shows aggressive behavior toward humans must be removed for public safety. He attacked my bodyguard, remember? Kestrel read the legal papers carefully, his jaw clenching as he absorbed their implications. Your man drew a weapon on a horse that was protecting its herd. Thunder's Shadow showed remarkable restraint. Tell that to the judge, Caldwell sneered. You have 24 hours to surrender the animal, or we'll take him by force. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Kestrel sat on his porch with Thunder's Shadow grazing peacefully nearby. The stallion's herd had dispersed throughout the pasture, but they remained alert, sensing their leader's tension. They want to take you, Kestrel said quietly. I could fight them in court, but Caldwell owns the judge. I could hide you, but they'll keep looking until they find you. He paused, his weathered hands trembling slightly. Or you could leave, tonight. Take your herd and disappear into the wilderness where they'll never find you. Thunder's Shadow lifted his head from the grass and looked at the man who had become his unlikely friend. In the gathering darkness, his eyes seemed to hold depths of understanding that challenged every assumption about the nature of animal intelligence. I won't blame you if you go, Kestrel continued. Freedom is what you were born for. These past months have been a gift for both of us, but maybe it's time to let you return to where you belong. The stallion took a step closer, then another, until he stood directly in front of the seated farmer. Slowly, deliberately, Thunder's Shadow lowered his great head until his muzzle touched Kestrel's shoulder, a gesture of affection that spoke louder than words. The next morning brought Senator Caldwell and his men, along with Judge Pemberton, and Sheriff Hartley, who looked deeply uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. A crowd of townspeople had gathered to witness what many saw as a travesty of justice. Where is he? Caldwell demanded, scanning the empty pastures. Kestrel emerged from his barn, his expression calm despite the storm raging in his heart. Gone, he said simply. Thunder's Shadow and his herd left during the night. They're free now, as they should be. The senator's face purpled with rage. You let them escape? That's obstruction of justice. No law against a wild horse choosing to leave, Sheriff Hartley said mildly, clearly relieved by this turn of events. Can't arrest a man for something an animal decided to do on its own. As the frustrated officials prepared to depart, a sound made everyone freeze, the drumming of approaching hooves. From the forest came Thunder's Shadow, alone, galloping across the meadow with his mane flowing like a banner of defiance. He didn't stop at the property line or hesitate at the sight of the assembled men. Instead, he galloped straight to Kestrel and came to a perfect halt beside the farmer, his breathing steady despite the hard run. The crowd fell silent, awed by what they were witnessing. Thunder's Shadow had been offered freedom, the thing he valued most, and he had chosen to return. Not because he was forced or broken, but because he had found something more precious than liberty, a bond built on mutual respect and love. Senator Caldwell reached for the lead rope one of his men offered, but Thunder's Shadow's ears flattened. Against his skull, a clear warning that he would not be taken peacefully. Touch him and he'll fight, Kestrel said quietly. Touch him and people will get hurt. Is that what you want? To be remembered as the man who destroyed a miracle? The senator hesitated, suddenly aware of the cameras pointed in his direction, and the crowd of witnesses watching his every move. In that moment of uncertainty, old Minerva Blackthorn stepped forward from the gathered townspeople. "Senator Caldwell," she said in a voice that carried the authority of her 87 years, "that horse just saved our entire valley. He chose to come back here, to this man who treats him with kindness instead of cruelty. What kind of people would we be if we repaid his loyalty with chains?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Dutch Carmichael, the fire chief, nodded his support. "The horse is a hero," he declared. "Heroes shouldn't be caged." One by one, the people of Cedar Valley spoke up. Farmers whose crops had been saved by Thunder's Shadow's actions. Families whose homes still stood because of his courage. Children who had learned that sometimes the wild and the tame could coexist in harmony. Faced with overwhelming public opposition and the knowledge that his political career might not survive the backlash, Senator Caldwell slowly lowered the lead rope. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the fight had gone out of his voice. As the officials departed and the crowd dispersed, Kestrel stood in his pasture with Thunder's Shadow, watching the sun set over the valley they had both chosen to call home. In the distance, Luna, Phoenix, and the old bay gelding emerged from the forest, returning to rejoin their leader, now that the danger had passed. "You could have been free," Kestrel whispered, his hand resting on the stallion's neck. Thunder's Shadow turned to look at him, and in those dark eyes, Kestrel saw the truth that poets and philosophers had struggled for centuries to express. Freedom isn't the absence of bonds, it's the choice of which bonds to accept. In choosing to return, Thunder's Shadow had found something rarer than liberty itself. He had found home. Years passed, and the story of the wild stallion who chose love over freedom became legend throughout the American West. Visitors came from around the world to see Thunder's Shadow and his herd, now thriving under Kestrel's gentle care. The farm became a sanctuary, not just for horses, but for any creature in need of healing and hope. Kestrel never tried to saddle Thunder's Shadow or ride him. Their relationship transcended such simple definitions of ownership and use. They were partners, each choosing the other across the ancient divide that separated wild from tame. And in the evenings, when the work was done and the valley lay peaceful under starlight, the former wild stallion and the quiet farmer would stand together in comfortable silence, proof that sometimes the gentlest hand can achieve what force never could. Not conquest, but communion, not domination, but trust freely given and gratefully received. They had said Thunder's Shadow could never be tamed. They were right. He had chosen something far more powerful than submission. He had chosen love,